We'll now begin story 1 titled, The Pepper That Funded a Republic, Venice's Spicy Rise to Power. You are standing in the middle of a lagoon, surrounded by wooden posts driven into mud centuries ago. The air smells faintly of salt and brine. It is hard to imagine this watery place Venice as the center of an empire, but for nearly 500 years it was. And at the heart of that power was not gold or iron but pepper. Tiny black pellets from a world far away, dried and bundled in burlap, unloaded by the thousands of sacks onto narrow docks beneath looming stone palazzos. Pepper, not even the most exotic spice, not saffron, not nutmeg, but it was pepper that funded palaces, fleets, and armies, pepper that whispered through ledger books, passed hands in silence on wooden benches in dim-lit counting houses. A humble spice that built an economy so robust that even the most powerful monarchs of Europe once borrowed from Venice. Let's go back not to the golden age of Venice in the 15th century, but earlier, to the slow, swampy beginning. The murky origins of a merchant city. Venice began as a refuge. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century and waves of Germanic tribes swept through northern Italy, many people fled into the shallow waters of the Venetian lagoon. They settled on islands where marshy ground and tides offered protection. It was not an ideal home. Land was scarce. Agriculture was nearly impossible. But what the settlers lacked in fertile soil, they made up for in something else: location. The lagoon sat at the northern end of the Adriatic Sea, a halfway mark between Constantinople and the rest of Europe, a place where east met west. And so, while other cities defended borders or tilled fields, Venice watched ships. Over time, as Europe trudged through the early Middle Ages, Venice grew not by war but by trade. While knights chased glory inland, the Venetians quietly became middlemen, ferrymen, and dealers. At the heart of this commerce was the spice trade. Pepper, a dull, dry gold. Today, pepper is found on every kitchen table, but in medieval Europe, it was rare and costly. Not only was it a prized seasoning breaking the monotony of bland, preserved foods, but it also served medical and symbolic functions. Pepper was believed to warm the body, aid digestion, and even repel the plague. For wealthy households, displaying bowls of whole peppercorns was a status symbol equivalent to fine china or gold leaf. The journey of pepper began thousands of miles away in the forests of Kerala on the Malabar coast of India. From there, it traveled by land and sea, passing through Arab middlemen, Ottoman markets, and Byzantine ports. Venice, tucked into its safe harbor, waited. It didn't produce spices, it simply moved them. And that act, moving goods, was the foundation of its empire. The Warehouse Republic. By the 11th century, Venice had become a maritime powerhouse, but not through conquest. Its leaders, the Doges, were elected, and its economy depended not on serfs or landholdings, but on trade routes and warehouses. Pepper came to Venice in waves. Merchant convoys called mude were dispatched in regular cycles. These convoys were a blend of public and private enterprise, part merchant fleet, part state apparatus. Individuals could buy cargo space or sponsor voyages. Risk was shared. Profits were huge. The spice warehouses, enormous, dark, and closely guarded, lined the Grand Canal. They were designed not just to store, but to regulate. The Republic tracked prices, volumes, and taxes meticulously. Every shipment of pepper was recorded. Pepper was weighed, inspected, and taxed. This system of control gave Venice an economic edge. Other cities might import spices sporadically. Venice moved them predictably, affordably, and reliably. It became the Amazon of its day, an early logistics empire, powered by galleys and ledgers. The quiet hand of the state. Venice's government, unlike the more chaotic courts of medieval kings, operated like a boardroom. The Republic was bureaucratic, often slow but deeply stable. Power was distributed among councils with a strong emphasis on continuity, and they knew what kept the coffers full: spices. To protect its interests, the Republic issued strict laws regulating pepper. Ships could not be privately dispatched without permission. Spice profits had to be declared. Fines were levied for inaccurate reporting. State-appointed inspectors monitored quality and moisture content. Spoiled pepper was burned to prevent tampering. This rigorous oversight didn't make headlines. There were no grand military campaigns for pepper, just men with scrolls, dipping quills in ink, tallying the weight of spice sacks under flickering lamplight. But in those ledgers, fortunes were made and lost. Spice and society. Pepper also trickled down through society not in terms of daily use, but in economic ripple effects. The docks of Venice bustled with porters and sailors. The shipyards of the arsenal employed thousands, building the vessels that carried spices. Rope makers, cooperages, sail weavers all were indirectly funded by pepper. Guilds formed around the movement and packaging of spices. Apprentices spent years learning how to recognize quality stock, how to seal crates, how to prevent infestation during long sea voyages. A single ship returning from Alexandria or Constantinople with its hull full of pepper could pay the wages of hundreds of workers. For the average Venetian, the spice trade wasn't about taste, it was about survival. Spices as politics. Venice's growing wealth made it powerful and resented. The Republic's relationship with Byzantium was both cooperative and competitive. Treaties were signed, revoked, and renegotiated. When the Crusades began, Venice saw opportunity. The Fourth Crusade, 1202–1204, would mark a turning point. Originally intended to reclaim Jerusalem, it was diverted under Venetian influence to Constantinople. The city was sacked. Venice took much of the loot, including key trading privileges and territories. This act of economic piracy wasn't accidental. It was calculated. Venice didn't need land. It needed access ports, routes, warehouses. And in that moment, pepper and power merged more clearly than ever before. A city built on imports. Venice's architectural wonders, the Basilica of San Marco, the Doge's Palace, the intricate mosaics, all were funded, directly or indirectly, by trade. Pepper was among the most valuable cargoes, but the network that moved it also brought glass, silk, cotton, and knowledge. Spice profits were reinvested into art and infrastructure. The entire city, floating atop wood piles, was proof that commerce could create civilization. But even at its height, Venice knew that trade was fragile. The tides of power were shifting. New maritime powers were rising, and pepper, abundant and profitable, was becoming a target. As we pause here, we might wonder, what happens when others want a slice of the spice pie? What does a republic do when its monopoly is threatened not by kings, but by companies? You sit again by the murky green water of the Venetian lagoon. The bells of St. Mark's Basilica toll faintly in the background, their sound carried by the damp, salt-heavy wind. Venice is thriving. Its ships arrive and depart with precision. Warehouses groan under the weight of spices. Pepper, that tiny black seed, continues to flow from east to west, and gold flows in the opposite direction. But not everyone is content to let Venice enjoy this dominance. In Section 1, we explored how pepper helped shape Venice's rise from a swampy refuge to a maritime superpower. But trade routes are not static. They shift with politics, ambition, and greed. As the Republic grew rich from its monopoly, eyes elsewhere began to narrow in jealousy. This is the story of how Venice's spice empire came under threat, not from pirates, not from warlords, but from new rivals with different tools: royal charters, gunpowder, and ocean-going vessels. A fragile monopoly. Monopolies in history rarely last. Even the best-organized systems cannot protect against ambition, geography, or innovation forever. Venice had built its dominance not by owning the origin of spices, but by mastering the middle. That middle was under siege. By the late 15th century, the world was changing. The Ottoman Empire had grown powerful. Constantinople fell in 1453, and with it came a new reality. The overland and near-sea spice routes those Venice had long depended on now lay under Ottoman control. The Ottomans didn't block trade outright. In fact, they taxed it heavily. But that taxation cut deeply into Venetian profits. Spices now cost more by the time they reached Venetian docks. The middlemen Venice had long counted on Arab, Persian, and Turkish traders were negotiating from positions of strength. The Republic responded with diplomacy. It brokered treaties, it paid tariffs, but the writing was on the wall. The choke point was no longer under Venetian influence. The lifeblood of the Republic flowed through hostile veins. And to the west, the Atlantic world was awakening. Portugal's silent expansion. While Venice polished its palazzos, something strange was happening on the edge of Europe. Portugal, once a modest kingdom preoccupied with local feuds, had begun launching ships along the coast of Africa. These weren't traditional cargo runs. These were exploratory missions, long, dangerous journeys around unfamiliar territory. The goal was simple, if absurd at the time: find a sea route to India. Why risk such a journey? Because the Portuguese were tired of paying Venetian prices for spices. They, too, wanted cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and pepper, but without the markups and middlemen. Venice, at first, paid little attention. What were a few dusty expeditions compared to the grandeur of the Mede convoys and the established trade ports of Alexandria, Constantinople, and Tyre? But the Portuguese were patient. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama reached Calicut, India. He didn't bring much back on that first voyage. A few spices, some exotic curiosities, but what he proved was world-changing. Spices could be reached directly by sea. A new kind of spice war. For Venice, this was not just a loss of trade, it was a loss of control. No longer would the Republic be able to set prices with confidence. Soon, European markets would be flooded with spices that never passed through the Adriatic. The Portuguese began building their own outposts along the Indian coast. They negotiated directly with spice producers, cutting out the Muslim and Jewish merchants who had long mediated between East and West. This wasn't just economic war, it was cultural, it was religious. The Portuguese claimed their trade was blessed by Christian destiny. Venice, ever the secular merchant, found itself trapped between empires, Islamic on one side, Catholic crusaders on the other. To protect its interests, Venice intensified its relationship with the Mamluks of Egypt, who controlled much of the Red Sea trade. It paid well for access. It fought diplomatically. But even as it navigated court politics in Cairo, a new pressure point emerged: the rise of Genoa and the merchant rivals. Venice's dominance had always irritated its nearest neighbor, Genoa. The two cities had clashed before, in a series of naval wars in the 13th and 14th centuries. Their rivalry was long-standing, a mix of personal, economic, and religious tensions. Genoa, too, had its eyes on the east. Now, with the Portuguese offering alternative routes, Genoa saw opportunity. It formed alliances. It funded expeditions. And while it never matched Venice's sheer volume of trade, Genoa contributed to the fragmentation of the spice monopoly. The Mediterranean was no longer a Venetian lake. It was a chessboard of merchants, mercenaries, and monarchs, and everyone wanted pepper. Spices as naval technology. One might assume that the spice trade was a passive activity, counting coins, balancing ledgers, but it fueled some of the most significant technological advancements of the age. Venetian shipbuilders, in response to rising threats, began developing more agile and better-armed merchant vessels. They added cannon ports, reinforced hulls, faster sails. The Arsenal Venice's massive shipbuilding complex adopted a proto-industrial system, capable of producing a fully equipped galley in a single day. Each vessel was marked not only with the crest of the Republic, but with a detailed manifest of cargo. Every pepper sack loaded required security. Every spice shipment meant sailors, guards, and pilots. Warships were sometimes disguised as cargo ships. Convoys were staggered to mislead pirates. Counterintelligence became essential. What began as simple trade now required espionage, engineering, and arms. The dagger of decline. Still, Venice was not immediately defeated. It remained a vital player into the 16th century, adapting its strategies. It leaned on its network of informants. It diversified its cargo's glass, textiles, and gold. It strengthened ties with German merchants through overland routes. But the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean expanded. Fortresses were built, treaties signed, new spices were discovered. Then came the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, had the backing of a powerful merchant republic ironically, not unlike Venice itself. But this was an aggressive, capitalized, militarized enterprise with global ambitions. Dutch fleets were faster, deadlier, and more ruthless. They burned spice plantations to control supply. They waged war on native kingdoms. They blockaded rival ports. Venice could not match this scale of aggression, nor did it want to. Its empire was built on precision, not conquest, but that model was no longer sustainable. The waning trade wins. By the early 17th century, the Venetian spice trade had diminished in importance. The city still thrived in many ways. Its art, architecture, and diplomacy remained admired, but its position in the global spice trade was no longer central. The same pepper that had built palaces now arrived in Europe through Lisbon, Amsterdam, and London. Venice began to look inward. Its economy turned toward luxury goods, tourism, and the arts. The Renaissance flowered there, funded in part by the lingering wealth of earlier spice days, but it was not the same. The Republic that once held the spice routes in its web of bureaucracy, and foresight now watched as the world moved past it. Still, the traces remain. Walk the narrow alleys of Venice today, and you'll find streets named after spice dealers Cal della Spezieria, the remnants of old warehouses, marble plaques commemorating ships and merchants, quiet reminders of a time when pepper ruled a republic. But this brings us to a lingering question. What became of the pepper planters, traders, and porters in the East? While Europe warred over logistics and monopoly, who grew the spices? What happened in the fields of Kerala as demand exploded? As you drift down the backwaters of Kerala, in the humid haze of India's southwestern coast, the world seems still. Coconut palms lean lazily over water channels. A single heron stabs at the shallows. The landscape is quiet, green, and moist, perfect for growing a spice that once shaped the fate of empires. Here, in the tangled undergrowth of the Malabar coast, pepper, the very same black spice that funded Venetian palaces and triggered Portuguese conquests, grows in abundance. But rarely do we hear the voices from this side of history. What did the global spice race look like from the perspective of the land where it all began? Let us now explore the forgotten growers, brokers, kingdoms, and betrayals that unfolded in the birthplace of black pepper. For while Venice declined and Europe fought, the true cost of empire was paid in these tropical hills and coastal villages. The root of empire, pepper's origins in Kerala. Piper nigrum, the black pepper vine, is a tropical perennial native to the forests of Kerala. It prefers heat, humidity, and shade. The plant climbs latching onto trees or wooden, supports its roots digging into the damp soil. The peppercorns themselves are the dried berries of the vine, harvested just before ripening and sun-dried into the familiar dark spheres. Pepper had been traded in Kerala for centuries before Europe even knew of it. Chinese, Arab, and later Persian traders docked along the Malabar coast as early as the 1st century BCE. Roman coins have been found in South Indian ports, a sign that even ancient empires knew the value of this spice. But by the 15th century, trade had become more centralized. Kingdoms like Calicut, Cochin, and Quilon became major pepper exporters. Rulers offered safe passage to foreign ships in exchange for tribute and political favor. Pepper was both a diplomatic tool and an economic lifeline. It was the local farmers, however, who cultivated it mostly in small, family-run plots, their knowledge passed down orally over generations. They were rarely paid in gold. The merchant middlemen of Malabar. Kerala's spice economy was layered. The growers lived inland, tending vines on the edges of forests or in the shade of coconut plantations. They sold their harvests to local brokers known as chetties or mupans who transported pepper to the ports. These brokers were influential, acting as intermediaries not just for trade, but for information, culture, and diplomacy. At the coastal markets, pepper was weighed using traditional balance scales. Transactions were often based on credit. Sometimes, instead of currency, payment came in cloth, tools, or dried fish. The brokers, more than the growers, interfaced with foreign merchants. Arab traders dominated this system for centuries. They brought not only goods but Islam, which took root among the coastal communities. Mosques were built. Arabic terms entered the Malayalam language. The pepper trade wasn't just commercial, it was cultural. But with the arrival of the Portuguese in 1498, everything changed. Vasco da Gama and the fracturing of trust. When Vasco da Gama arrived in Calicut, he carried letters from the Portuguese king, a few gifts, and a long list of demands. He expected a royal welcome. Instead, he was treated like any other foreign trader given a place in the port, offered an audience with the local Zamorin ruler, and charged duties like the rest. Da Gama bristled. He had come for privilege, not parity. In his eyes, Calicut was a backwater. In truth, it was a thriving cosmopolitan city, home to a diverse population of Hindus, Muslims, and Christians, where merchants from Arabia, Africa, and Southeast Asia had mingled for centuries. Unable to secure favorable terms, Da Gama left violently. On his second voyage, he bombarded Calicut's harbor. He later captured and burned an Arab merchant ship with over 300 civilians on board, many of them pilgrims. His message was clear. Portugal intended to dominate the spice trade, not participate in it. Cochin, the pepper port that turned the tide. After burning bridges in Calicut, the Portuguese turned to a rival kingdom, Cochin. This small port city south of Calicut had long played second fiddle in regional politics. Its leaders, eager to gain leverage against the more powerful Zamorin, welcomed Portuguese support. In exchange for military protection, the Portuguese were granted favorable trade terms and allowed to build a Fort Emmanuel in 1503. This was one of the first European fortresses in India and marked the beginning of sustained European colonization. Pepper flowed out of Cochin and cannon fire protected it. The local economy was reshaped. The Portuguese no longer relied on intermediaries. They wanted direct access to the spice gardens inland, and when resistance appeared, they responded with brutal force. For the small farmers and brokers, this meant upheaval. Traditional networks were upended. Prices were manipulated. Entire villages were relocated to suit Portuguese control. Pepper, once a symbol of wealth and culture, became a currency of occupation. Resistance and rebellion in the Spice Hills. The Portuguese control over the spice trade in Kerala was never absolute. Even in Cochin, tensions simmered. The Zamorin of Calicut continued to resist, building alliances with Arab traders and neighboring kingdoms. Local chiefs, nairs, and militias began to target Portuguese caravans inland. Attacks on forts and spice warehouses became common. Pepper vines were sometimes deliberately destroyed by resisting villagers to prevent foreign profit. Religious tensions also grew. The Portuguese often insisted on the construction of churches and conversion of locals, While some converted either by faith or pressure, many others resented the intrusion. This cultural friction added fuel to the resistance. Even as Portugal expanded its foothold, it found itself bogged down in endless skirmishes and costly fort maintenance. The cost of controlling the spice did not always match the profits. The Dutch arrive, a new chapter of control. In 1605, the Dutch arrived on the Malabar coast. They didn't arrive as saviors. They arrived as strategists. The Dutch East India Company, wealthier and more methodical than the Portuguese crown, began to court local rulers. Their goal was not coexistence, it was exclusivity. They offered better prices, more reliable contracts, and crucially, military assistance against the Portuguese. By the mid-17th century, Cochin fell to the Dutch. The fort changed hands. The pepper trade was rerouted once more. But the pattern continued. Spices flowed out. Foreign ships controlled ports. Local voices were drowned out by contracts written in languages they did not speak. Violence and treaty alternated, one always following the other. The forgotten hands behind the global spice market. Throughout all these shifts, from Arab traders to Portuguese fleets to Dutch monopolies, the local pepper growers endured. Rarely did their names appear in the records of European merchants, but without them, there was no trade. They learned to adapt. Some bartered with minor traders who operated under the radar. Others moved their farms deeper into the hills. Pepper cultivation became not just an agricultural act, but a quiet resistance. Even in times of famine, disease, and war, pepper vines were tended, because for many families this was all they had. And while the fortunes of Venice, Lisbon, and Amsterdam rose and fell with the spice market, the people who grew the pepper lived in cycles of scarcity, negotiation, and survival. Echoes in the present. Today, Kerala still grows pepper. Smallholder farmers still climb ladders to handpick the berries. The vines still cling to tall poles, rising 10-12 feet into the tropical air. But now, pepper prices are determined by global markets, multinational companies, and speculative traders in cities like London or Chicago. The labor remains local. The profit is global. In Venice, tourists float by on gondolas, unaware that the wealth behind the stone facades once came from these peppercorns. In Kerala, some farmers are switching to more profitable crops. Others hold on, nurturing vines that have been in their family for generations. The spice that built empires, that funded republics and started wars, is still there hanging quietly in the shade. Reflection. Pepper was never just a seasoning. It was a system, a quiet force that moved ships, reshaped cities, and defined the rhythm of life for millions. And while European powers debated maps and monopolies, the real work, the dull, daily, backbreaking work, happened under tropical canopies. So the next time you grind pepper onto your food, consider this. How much of our modern world was built on something as small, as ordinary as a berry? And what other forgotten forces, quiet, constant, seemingly insignificant, are shaping our world today, just as pepper once did? Story 2. Cloves and Colonies. The Dutch East India Company's ruthless quest. Close your eyes, inhale deeply. The air is rich, warm, fragrant, not with roses or pine or rain, but with cloves. The scent lingers on your skin, sharp and dry, sweet yet almost antiseptic. This is the scent that drew ships from thousands of miles away. That sparked war, betrayal, and colonization. This is the scent of the Maluku Islands, also known as the Spice Islands. In this story, we journey to these tiny islands of volcanic soil and lush forest where a single spice changed the fate of entire peoples. We trace the rise of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, a corporate juggernaut that combined capitalism with colonial violence. And we start, as always, not in the grand strategy rooms of Europe, but among trees. Clove trees. The Maluku Islands, a fragile paradise. The clove tree, Syzygium aromaticum, is picky. It does not thrive just anywhere. It requires a humid, tropical climate, volcanic soil, and protection from strong winds. For centuries, it grew nowhere else in the world but the Maluku Islands, particularly the smaller islands of Ternate, Tidore, Ambon, and Banda in what is now Indonesia. Clove buds were harvested by hand before they flowered, tiny, closed pink blossoms plucked from trees and sun-dried until dark brown. These were then traded overland and overseas in small quantities, eventually finding their way into China, India, and the Middle East. Cloves had medicinal uses. They were burned as incense, chewed to freshen breath, used to numb toothaches. In Europe, cloves were symbols of luxury, health, and power, and for a long time they were rare. Very rare. Because the people of the Moluccas guarded the trees, and they knew that the fewer cloves left the islands, the higher their value. This delicate balance of local control and foreign demand held until the arrival of European powers. The Portuguese arrival. In 1512, the first Portuguese ships reached the Maluku Islands. They came not by accident, but by careful planning, following the earlier Portuguese success on the Indian coast. Their goal was to bypass Arab and Asian middlemen and buy cloves at the source. The Portuguese quickly established trading relations, especially with the Sultan of Ternate. They built a fort, established a garrison, and introduced Christianity. But unlike in Kerala, where they encountered large, established kingdoms, in the Moluccas the power was more fragmented. Sultanates existed, yes, but the islands were small, their politics personal, tribal, and constantly shifting. The Portuguese tried to impose order, but they were few in number and far from home. And while they gained a foothold, they never achieved total dominance. Their time was limited. Enter the Dutch, commerce as conquest. By the late 16th century, the Portuguese Empire was overstretched. Their monopoly on the spice trade had made them enemies, and in 1580, Portugal was annexed by Spain. Spain, in turn, was at war with the Dutch. The Dutch, newly independent and fiercely commercial, saw opportunity. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or VOC, was founded. It was a corporation unlike anything the world had ever seen. Backed by the Dutch state but run like a private enterprise, the VOC could wage war, sign treaties, build forts, maintain armies, and most importantly, trade spices for profit. Its goal was singular: total control of the spice trade. The VOC lands in Ambon. The Dutch arrived in Ambon in 1605, pushing out the weakened Portuguese with minimal resistance. They built their own Fort Victoria and declared Ambon the administrative center of the VOC's eastern spice trade. From the beginning, the Dutch approach was different. While the Portuguese relied on diplomacy, Christianity, and limited force, the Dutch introduced structured brutality. They created contracts that locked islanders into exclusive trade agreements. Any attempt to sell to outsiders, especially English traders, was considered treason. The VOC imposed quotas. Farmers were ordered to grow only cloves. Other crops were banned. Entire villages were relocated. Trees in rival areas were uprooted or burned. This wasn't trade. This was plantation colonialism backed by gunpowder. Monopoly through destruction. One of the VOC's most infamous strategies was extirpation, the deliberate destruction of clove trees in areas outside their control to prevent unauthorized supply. In an economy based on scarcity, it made sense to burn the product to maintain the price. Hundreds of thousands of clove trees were destroyed. Locals were forced to reveal hidden groves under torture or threats. VOC soldiers combed through the forests like customs agents with muskets. Imagine that. A spice so valuable, its supply was policed with fire and steel. For the people of the Moluccas, this was more than economic devastation. It was cultural loss. Generations had grown up with clove cultivation as a way of life. Now, it was a matter of survival under surveillance. Resistance and the English intrusion. Of course, not all the islanders complied. Some fled to other islands. Others harbored English traders who occasionally arrived hopping to cut deals. Tensions between the Dutch and the English flared repeatedly, culminating in one of the darkest episodes of VOC history, the Ambona Massacre. In 1623, VOC authorities in Ambon accused a group of English traders, along with Japanese mercenaries and some local islanders, of plotting to seize the Dutch fort. After a swift trial and interrogation that involved waterboarding and torture, the accused were executed. The event outraged England, though they were in no position to retaliate at the time. The massacre became propaganda, used for generations to justify later British incursions into Dutch territories. Meanwhile, the VOC's grip tightened. Forced loyalty, fragile control. In many ways, the VOC was a modern corporation. It issued shares, paid dividends, kept detailed records, but it ruled like a state. Governors were appointed, armies deployed. The profits from cloves and nutmeg funded Dutch infrastructure back in Europe: canals, universities, and public buildings. But ruling over tropical islands from thousands of miles away was never easy. Tropical diseases, monsoons, and constant resistance meant that every year, more resources were needed just to maintain control. The local populations were under near military rule. Clove harvests were taxed. Labor was coerced. Even children were pressed into work. The VOC maintained schooling systems meant more for indoctrination than education. And the very thing they were fighting so hard to control, the trees, continued to grow in secret. The quiet rebellion of the forest. Despite extirpation policies, clove trees survived. Islanders hid seeds in clay pots, planted them in remote valleys, or passed them along during marriages as secret dowries. Knowledge of clove cultivation, when to pick, how to dry, how to identify young trees, became a quiet form of rebellion. Some villages became known for underground cultivation. When VOC officers came to inspect, entire forests would be disguised or cleared. But the scent lingered, and the VOC in turn doubled down. In some places, clove trees became symbols of resistance. Rituals were performed around them, songs written, oral histories preserved the memory of times before foreign rule. The trees survived, and so did the spirit of the people. You are standing in a clearing somewhere in the Banda Islands, the sun filtered through a thick canopy of nutmeg and clove trees. The air is hot, the soil soft beneath your feet, and the scent of spice is ever-present, sweet, dry, intoxicating. But beneath that sweet perfume lies a darker history. Because the spice trade was not just about profit, it was about power, violence, and extermination. In Section 1, we traced how the Dutch East India Company, VOC, secured a foothold in the Maluku Islands, imposing a monopoly on the clove trade. Now in Section 2, we shift focus to the brutal enforcement of that monopoly, especially in Banda, where cloves shared space with nutmeg, and resistance sparked a massacre. The story of the clove trade in the 17th century is one of bureaucracy backed by brutality. It is a tale of contracts signed at gunpoint, of trees set ablaze, and of entire communities erased in the pursuit of fragrant monopoly. The Banda Islands, spice in isolation. The Banda Islands, part of the Maluku archipelago, were among the only places on Earth where nutmeg and mace grew naturally. While our focus is on cloves, it's crucial to understand that the VOC viewed all spices in the region, nutmeg, mace, and cloves, as a single system. Controlling one meant controlling them all. The Bandanese had long resisted foreign domination. Unlike Ambon or Ternate, where European forts were established early, Banda was a fiercely independent confederation of villages ruled by local elders, or Ankaya. Trade here was flexible. English, Arab, and Javanese merchants all did business freely provided they respected local autonomy. That model was not compatible with VOC policy. The Dutch didn't want trade partners. They wanted submission, the monopolistic mindset of the VOC. By 1610, the VOC had made it clear no island was to grow cloves, nutmeg, or mace unless under exclusive contract with the Dutch. The goal was not merely to purchase spices but to own the production, control the land, and fix the prices. In Banda, this was unacceptable. The Orang Kaya resisted Dutch attempts at treaty enforcement. They wanted to trade with multiple buyers, especially the English, who often offered better prices. The Bandanese knew that scarcity increased their leverage, and they were willing to gamble. To the VOC, this was rebellion. To enforce its will, the company sent Jan Pieter Zoon Coen, a ruthless governor-general with a clear mission: eliminate resistance. The Banda Massacre, 1621, a forgotten genocide. Coen arrived in Banda with a fleet and several hundred Dutch soldiers, Japanese mercenaries, and local auxiliaries. His orders were direct: force the Bandanese into submission. If they refused, destroy them. In 1621, after a failed attempt at negotiation, Coen launched a full-scale assault. Villages were razed, men were slaughtered, women and children were captured or killed. The massacre is one of the earliest examples of organized genocide under corporate policy. By the time the violence ended, estimates suggest between 10,000 and 15,000 Bandanese had been killed, nearly the entire native population of the islands. Those who survived were enslaved, relocated, or forced into labor. VOC officials parceled the land into plantation estates, perken, granting them to Dutch settlers known as perkeniers. The clove and nutmeg trees, now under Dutch ownership, continued to grow. But the people who had once tended them, traded them, sung about them were gone. Spices as plantation capitalism. Following the massacre, the VOC implemented a plantation system that foreshadowed the colonial economies of the 18th and 19th centuries. Each perkenier received a section of land, a labor force of enslaved people, often from other islands or imported from Africa, and obligations to deliver fixed quotas of spice to the VOC. In return, they received protection, pricing guarantees, and social status. These were not gentlemen farmers. They were often former soldiers, VOC agents, or adventurers. Their profits came not from innovation or efficiency, but from control and enforcement. The system ran on fear. If a quota wasn't met, punishment followed: public floggings, fines, or worse. Plantation slaves lived under constant surveillance. Rebellion was met with swift retribution. And all of this, again, for cloves' small, dried flower buds. The cost of exclusivity. By the mid-1600s, the VOC had achieved something unprecedented: a nearly complete monopoly over the global clove and nutmeg trade. But at what cost? Entire communities had been wiped out. Thousands of trees had been destroyed to control supply. Fortresses dotted the islands, constantly requiring maintenance and defense. Trade routes needed protection from pirates, rivals, and weather. Plantation economies required food, water, and governance. In Amsterdam, VOC shareholders celebrated. Dividends were high. The company was hailed as a triumph of Dutch enterprise. But on the ground, the system was fragile. It depended on obedience of nature, of people, of politics. And obedience rarely lasts forever. Seeds of resistance, the return of the English. Despite the VOC's grip, the English East India Company, EIC, never truly gave up its ambitions in the region. From their base in Banten on Java's western coast, English merchants continued to seek footholds. They offered better prices to inland growers. They bribed VOC officials. they smuggled spices. Tensions rose, skirmishes broke out, but outright war was often too costly for either side. Still, the very existence of competition eroded the VOC's monopoly. And beyond the English threat, the Dutch also faced internal resistance, local rebellions, and cultural defiance. In the decades following the Banda massacre, VOC rule remained harsh and deeply resented. On the neighboring island of Ternate, uprisings flared regularly. In Ambon, escaped laborers formed hidden communities in the jungle. Some locals pretended compliance but secretly grew clove trees in inaccessible valleys. Others fled to regions not yet under VOC control, bringing clove seeds with them. The VOC responded by expanding its extirpation program, searching out and burning unauthorized trees, often punishing entire villages in the process. But these efforts were increasingly unsustainable. The more territory the company tried to control, the more it had to invest in soldiers, inspectors, and ships. The cost of maintaining exclusivity began to outweigh the profits. And the world was changing. Smuggling, slipping control, and botanical theft. By the late 17th century, VOC spices were being smuggled out in increasing quantities by Arab traders, Malay seafarers, and even rogue company employees. Clove seeds began appearing in European botanical gardens. Colonists in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean islands started experimenting with transplantation. The company, which had once held the keys to the global spice vault, began to lose its grip. In the 18th century, the French successfully transplanted clove trees to Mauritius and Réunion. The British followed, planting them in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Zanzibar. The monopoly, built over a century through blood and bureaucracy, unraveled. The price of cloves fell. A question of memory. The VOC would linger until its bankruptcy in 1799, its assets absorbed by the Dutch government. By then, the world had moved on. Spices were still valuable, but they no longer held the same mystique, the same imperial power. The clove trees remained, the plantations remained, but the Bandanese were gone. And the massacre, the plantations, the forced labor, all of it was quietly folded into the margins of European history. Which leaves us to ask, how do we remember a massacre committed for a flavor? And what happens when that flavor becomes so common, we forget the cost it once carried? It is dawn in the modern Maluku Islands. The jungle is still. A clove tree, taller than a house, sways in the wind. Its buds, pale green, nearly pink, have yet to be harvested. A farmer in a small village prepares to scale its trunk using nothing but a length of cloth wrapped around his feet. This is how it is still done. The tree is climbed barefoot, the buds picked by hand. Once dried, they will be sold in local markets, packed for export, and ground into spice racks around the world. Few who use them will know the cost. The stories buried under centuries of forced contracts, massacres, and corporate colonialism. In this final section of Story 2, we trace the slow decline of the VOC monopoly, the transformation of cloves from empire builders to everyday ingredients, and the legacy left behind in Indonesia, in Europe, and in the way we remember history itself. The VOC's slow collapse. By the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company was no longer the omnipotent juggernaut it had once been. A combination of internal corruption, administrative overreach, and changing global trade patterns had weakened its foundations. The VOC was a company trying to govern like a state, but without the flexibility or moral legitimacy required for long-term rule. Even as the Dutch controlled dozens of forts across the East Indies, their grip on spice monopolies began to crumble. Clove trees had been smuggled to other colonies. Prices fell. Profits declined. The very success of the VOC's economic model based on exclusivity and scarcity meant that once that scarcity vanished, the the system could not sustain itself. By 1799, the company was officially dissolved. Its debts were absorbed by the Dutch state, and its colonial holdings were reorganized into what would later become the Dutch East Indies, a formal colony under direct crown rule. But even in collapse, the VOC had left something behind, a blueprint for modern exploitation. The legacy of forced cultivation. In post-VOC Indonesia, forced spice cultivation did not end, it evolved. The cultivation system, cultuestelsel, was introduced by the Dutch colonial government in the 19th century. Farmers were required to dedicate a portion of their land and labor to export crops, including cloves, coffee, sugar, and indigo. The profits enriched the Dutch treasury and helped finance infrastructure projects in the Netherlands such as railways, museums, and universities. For Indonesian farmers, however, the system meant reduced food security, poverty, and famine. The echoes of VOC policy could still be heard in the contracts, coercion, and colonial violence of the 1800s. Clove cultivation remained a core part of this system, but by now, the spice had lost its aura. It was no longer the exotic marvel that once sparked naval battles. It had become a commodity measured, priced, and moved like any other agricultural product. Cloves beyond the Moluccas, a global journey. With the VOC gone, clove cultivation spread across the tropical world. Zanzibar, under Omani Arab rule in the 19th century, became a major center of clove production. Slavery fueled the plantations. The clove trade made Zanzibar one of the richest islands in the Indian Ocean at the cost of unimaginable human suffering. Madagascar and Sri Lanka also began producing cloves under French and British colonial influence, respectively. In the Caribbean, spice cultivation including cloves was tested, but never achieved the success of the Indian Ocean colonies. The global supply of cloves increased dramatically. Prices fell. The once sacred buds, once worth more than gold by weight, were now found in kitchen cupboards across Europe. They flavored mulled wine, spiced Christmas cookies, studded hams. No longer rare, no longer revered, cloves had become ordinary. But the lands that grew them, Maluku, Zanzibar, and others, still bore the marks of extraction. The Maluku Islands today. The modern Maluku Islands are part of Indonesia. They remain remote, underdeveloped, and economically dependent on agriculture and fishing. Spice farming, especially cloves and nutmeg, still plays an important role in the local economy. In villages across Ambon, Ternate, and Tidore, traditional clove farming methods persist. Families work the land together. Harvests are seasonal. Drying racks are built from woven bamboo. Yet much of the global spice trade is now controlled by multinational companies. The growers, just like centuries ago, rarely set the price. Middlemen dominate local markets. Exporters take the lion's share. Clove prices fluctuate with demand for cigarettes. Cloves are a key ingredient in Indonesian kretek cigarettes, perfumes, and baked goods. For many farmers, cloves remain both a gift and a burden, valuable, yes, but vulnerable to exploitation, weather, and the invisible hand of distant markets. The erasure of memory. Despite the magnitude of VOC violence in the Moluccas, much of it remains underacknowledged in mainstream historical narratives, particularly outside Indonesia. European textbooks often reference the VOC as an innovative company or a precursor to capitalism. Its atrocities, the Banda massacre, forced labor systems, cultural erasure, are minimized or framed as unfortunate byproducts of ambition. Yet for those whose ancestors lived through the centuries of spice-fueled occupation, the wounds are more than metaphorical. In Banda, monuments quietly mark the massacre of 1621. In Ambon, old Dutch forts stand as reminders, weathered by time and covered in moss. Oral histories and folk songs preserve the memory of lost villages, stolen land, and burned trees. But memory fades, and without recognition, forgetting becomes policy. Cloves in the modern world. Today, the clove exists in a strange duality. In Europe and North America, it is cozy, a smell of winter, of warmth, of comfort. In Indonesia, it is labor, the smell of work, of harvest, of history. Cloves flavor traditional dishes across Southeast Asia. They're used in Chinese medicine. In the Middle East, cloves are brewed into tea. In India, they're part of garam masala. In Africa, they're used in meat preservation and rituals. The clove is truly global, but its story is deeply local, rooted in soil once stained by blood, nurtured by hands once enslaved. Lessons from a bud. What can we learn from this journey? That corporations can wield power like states. That resources, no matter how small, can trigger vast systems of control. That history is often written by the buyers, not the growers. And that even something as sweet as a spice can leave a bitter legacy. We still use cloves today. We still inhale their scent. But how often do we think of the trees, of the people who climbed them, of the villages that vanished so they could be owned? Perhaps the next time you catch the scent of cloves in a winter drink or a festive pie, you'll pause. And remember. Story 3. The Cinnamon Wars of Ceylon. The breeze is heavy with a scent, warm, sweet, woody. It's not perfume. It's not incense. It's the bark of a tree. On this island, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, cinnamon grows along the coastal plains and forest edges. The smell is everywhere, embedded in the soil, on the fingers of harvesters, in the folds of shipping sacks bound for distant ports. It's hard to imagine today, but for hundreds of years, this subtle bark was one of the most sought-after commodities in the world. A luxury, a currency, a cause for conquest. In this first section of the third story, we uncover how the unassuming cinnamon tree drew the attentions of empires. From Arab traders to Portuguese explorers, from Dutch governors to British colonists, the island of Ceylon became a battlefield not of flags, but of flavor. And at the center of it all, the cinnamon peelers, silent, skilled, and forgotten. Cinnamon, bark of the ancients. Cinnamon, derived from the inner bark of the Cinnamomum verum tree, has been known and traded for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, it was used in embalming. In Rome, it was burned on funeral pyres of emperors. By medieval times in Europe, it flavored meats, sweetened wine, and even masked the scent of decay. But Ceylon cinnamon was different, more delicate, aromatic, the true cinnamon. Long before Europeans arrived, the Arab traders of the Indian Ocean had already established a spice network that reached Ceylon's shores. They controlled access, prices, and ports. Cinnamon reached Alexandria, Constantinople, and Venice through this complex, multi-layered trade. And as with pepper and cloves, Europeans grew tired of paying premiums. They wanted direct access. They wanted the bark and the trees. The Portuguese make landfall, 1505. In 1505, the Portuguese under Lourenço de Almeida landed on the shores of Ceylon. They were not seeking conquest, at first. They came for trade, offering European goods in exchange for cinnamon. They soon discovered that the Kingdom of Kut, one of the three major Sinhalese kingdoms, controlled much of the cinnamon-growing coast. The king, Vira Parakrama Bahu Vii, agreed to grant the Portuguese favorable trade rights in return for protection against rival rulers. It was a simple arrangement on paper, but like most colonial agreements, it sowed the seeds of future conflict. Control through forts and faith. As Portuguese influence grew, so did their ambitions. They constructed forts at key coastal points like Colombo and Gala. They began interfering in internal politics, backing certain kings and heirs in exchange for trade concessions. They sent missionaries to convert the population to Christianity, undermining Buddhist and Hindu authority. But most importantly, They monopolized the cinnamon trade. Local harvesters, previously free to trade with Arabs, were now subject to strict Portuguese oversight. The trade was no longer open, it was regulated, taxed, and controlled by Lisbon. The Portuguese crown profited immensely. Cinnamon shipments flowed steadily into Europe. Prices were kept high by restricting supply, and any unauthorized gathering or trading of cinnamon became a punishable offense. But Ceylon was not a land easily subdued. The rise of Kandy, mountain resistance. In the island's central highlands, the kingdom of Kandy watched with growing concern. While the lowlands and coasts fell under Portuguese sway, the mountainous interior remained fiercely independent. The Kandian kings, particularly Raja Singh I, viewed Portuguese interference as a direct threat to sovereignty. They refused conversion. They refused trade treaties, and they offered sanctuary to those fleeing the coast, including cinnamon harvesters who refused to serve foreign masters. Skirmishes turned into sieges. Forts were attacked. Portuguese expeditions into the interior were ambushed and repelled. The cinnamon trade, once a matter of commerce, had become a matter of war. Cinnamon harvesting, the quiet labor. Amidst this turmoil, the actual work of cinnamon harvesting continued quiet, precise, and laborious. Cinnamon was not picked, it was peeled. Skilled workers, known as salagama peelers, used small brass knives to strip the bark from young cinnamon branches. The outer bark was scraped away. The inner bark was then curled into quills, the familiar cinnamon sticks. The process was delicate. Trees had to be cultivated, monitored, and cut at the right age. Overharvesting could kill a tree. Poor technique reduced the value of the bark. For generations, the Salagama caste had passed down this knowledge. They were respected artisans, but under colonial rule, they became laborers bound by regulation. The Portuguese forced entire communities to meet quotas. Failure meant punishment. Surplus was seized, and no one but the crown could trade the bark. The peelers labored in silence, caught between kings and colonizers, their work essential yet invisible. The Dutch arrived 1638, cinnamon's new masters. By the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, had begun challenging Portuguese dominance across the Indian Ocean. They had already taken spice ports in Indonesia. Ceylon was next. In 1638, the Dutch formed a strategic alliance with the Kandian kingdom. The Kandian king, Rajasingha II, saw an opportunity to oust the Portuguese. He offered cinnamon rights to the VOC in exchange for military aid. The Dutch accepted and then betrayed the deal. Once the Portuguese were expelled from most coastal regions, by 1658, the Dutch took control of the cinnamon trade for themselves. Like the Portuguese, they built forts, imposed quotas, and regulated harvests. The Kandians, now surrounded by foreign powers, retreated into the mountains, waging an uneasy cold war of resistance and sabotage. Ceylon's cinnamon was now firmly in European hands, but the conflict was far from over. As the VOC fortified the coast and built a cinnamon monopoly even stricter than the Portuguese had dreamed of, a new question emerged. How long can foreign powers hold a commodity hostage when the labor, knowledge, and land do not belong to them? The coasts of Ceylon, once dotted with villages, temples, and salt pans, now bristled with Dutch forts. Behind those walls, not just soldiers, but administrators, bookkeepers, and company agents measured, recorded, and regulated one thing above all: cinnamon. It wasn't gold, it wasn't silver, it was bark. But that bark, peeled with brass knives by deft hands, fueled profits, paid dividends in Amsterdam, and justified occupation. In Section 1, we witness the Portuguese arrival and the handover of coastal control to the Dutch. In Section 2, we go deeper into the mechanics of VOC rule, the pressure on local communities, the failed alliances with Kandian kings, and the emergence of cinnamon as a weapon of empire. This is the quiet violence of trade, written not in battle reports, but in harvest quotas and forced labor rosters. The Dutch strategy, regulation and rationing. Upon seizing Portuguese forts, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, immediately implemented strict trade protocols. All cinnamon had to be delivered to VOC warehouses. Local harvesters were paid fixed wages, often below subsistence. Entire districts were assigned quotas, regardless of yield. Trees were mapped, managed, and monitored like military assets. The VOC brought in surveyors to catalog groves. If a village failed to meet quota, it was penalized. If a tree was stripped too early or improperly, fines followed. Peeling became not just an art but a regulated obligation. This model, a colonial command economy, was designed for maximum extraction with minimum cost. It worked for a while. The peelers and their burden. The Salagama caste hereditary cinnamon peelers bore the brunt of VOC demands. Their skill made them indispensable, but their position made them vulnerable. In return for protection and access to the land, the Dutch made the Salagama legally responsible for cinnamon harvesting. They could not refuse. During harvest season, men, women, and even children were conscripted. Villages emptied at dawn. Peelers carried tools, food rations, and baskets deep into the forests. Work began with cutting branches from trees that had been carefully aged, usually 2 to 3 years old. The outer bark was scraped. The inner bark was carefully loosened in long, thin strips, then sun-dried and rolled into quills. The cinnamon quills were tied in bundles, weighed, taxed, and then shipped first to Gala or Colombo, and then onward to Batavia, Amsterdam, or London. Harvesters saw none of these destinations. They returned home exhausted, their wages delayed or reduced. Still, they returned to the forests the next year and the next. The Kingdom of Kandy, ally turned adversary. The Kingdom of Kandy, once hopeful that the Dutch would restore local autonomy, found itself betrayed. The Dutch controlled the cinnamon-producing coastline. The VOC now refused to honor the initial trade agreements with King Rajasinha II. Kandy, nestled in the Central Highlands, became a thorn in the company's side. The Dutch, fearing an uprising, fortified their boundaries. They attempted to choke off supplies into the interior. Kandy responded with ambushes, raids, and alliances with other enemies of the Dutch, sometimes even the British. Between 1659 and 1707, a tense equilibrium held. Neither side fully controlled the other. Neither could be ignored. And in the background, cinnamon still flowed slowly, steadily, under duress. The forest as resistance. Even under strict Dutch management, the forests resisted. Monsoons destroyed bark stores. Fungal blight weakened trees. Hidden groves, planted in secret by rebellious villagers, disrupted quotas. More subtly, sabotage emerged. Villagers under quota pressure began to overharvest, killing younger trees and reducing future yields. Some peeled bark improperly so that it spoiled during drying. Others hid part of the harvest and traded it through illegal networks inland. In response, the VOC expanded its surveillance. Inspectors rode horseback from village to village. Harvest schedules were posted on walls in Dutch, unreadable to most villagers. Punishments included whippings, imprisonment, or forced relocation. The trees grew quietly, but so did resentment. Amsterdam's view, profits and paperwork. Back in the Netherlands, the cinnamon trade was viewed in purely economic terms. Each cinnamon shipment was logged in VOC ledgers. Bundles were weighed to the gram. Charts were drawn tracking productivity by district. Every delay, every labor dispute, every monsoon loss was reduced to a line item. To VOC directors, cinnamon was data measurable, quantifiable, billable. The human side exhausted peelers, failing trees, scorched villages was invisible behind paper and ink. Dividends remained strong throughout the late 1600s. The price of cinnamon was kept high through artificial scarcity. Export quantities were deliberately limited. Any competitor Arab, Indian, or even rogue Dutch traders was shut out. The Dutch had learned the art of monopoly well. Cracks in the bark, the British appear. By the early 1700s, however, the world began to shift. The British East India Company, EIC, had gained a stronghold in India and begun eyeing Ceylon. While the VOC maintained its grip, it was increasingly overstretched. Its forts required constant defense. The cinnamon trees needed tending. Labor disputes grew. The Kandyan kingdom remained hostile. Worse, global tastes were changing. While cinnamon remained popular, it faced competition from other spices, nutmeg, clove, even sugar, and competitors were beginning to grow cinnamon elsewhere. The once exclusive bark was no longer so rare. Still, the VOC held on because cinnamon had become more than a spice. It was a symbol of control, a system near breaking. By the mid-18th century, the VOC was spending more to maintain cinnamon operations than it was earning. Trees were overharvested and yields declined. Laborers began fleeing coastal areas for the Kandyan Hills. Corruption among local Dutch administrators hollowed out the plantation system. Yet the company continued, driven by inertia and fear of losing its perceived superiority. Cinnamon, for all its declining value, remained a colonial obsession. But obsessions have limits. A question of worth. As the Dutch fortified their final outposts, the question lingered. Was the cinnamon worth it? Thousands had died by war, disease, or forced labor. Forests had been cleared, cultures upended, and generations bound to quotas. And yet the product itself, light, brittle strips of bark, was fleeting. It flavored food for seconds. It burned away in incense. It faded into memory. For the Dutch, it had been profit. For the peelers, it had been survival. For Ceylon, it had been control. A cinnamon tree stands on the edge of an old colonial road in modern-day Sri Lanka. Its bark is pale brown, smooth, unremarkable to a passerby. But if you peel it carefully, slowly, and dry it in the sun, the scent is unmistakable. Warm, sweet, and faintly sharp. The scent that once fueled conquest. In Section 2, we explored the height of Dutch monopoly. Quotas, fortifications, forced labor, and high profit margins. In this final section of Story 3, we follow cinnamon's descent from imperial treasure to everyday flavor. We trace the collapse of VOC power, the arrival of the British, and the lasting impact of cinnamon's colonial past on Sri Lanka and beyond. The monopoly is ending, but the structures it built, the scars it left remain. The VOC's unraveling. By the late 1700s, the Dutch East India Company was bleeding. The spice monopolies, once gold mines, had become financial sinkholes. The cinnamon trade was especially costly. Forests had been exhausted by decades of overharvesting. Cinnamon prices dropped as illegal and rival cultivation increased. Laborers, underpaid and abused, fled or resisted. Smuggling became widespread, with cinnamon reaching markets outside VOC control. On paper, the company still controlled Ceylon's cinnamon. In reality, control was slipping. By 1796, the VOC could no longer sustain its colonial infrastructure. Political unrest in Europe, especially the Napoleonic Wars, diverted resources and attention. In that vacuum, a new empire stepped in. The British takeover of Ceylon, 1796-1802. The British East India Company, already well established in India, recognized the strategic and commercial value of Ceylon. When the Netherlands fell under French influence in 1795, Britain swiftly moved to secure Dutch territories in Asia. In 1796, British forces occupied Colombo, taking control of Dutch forts and administrative centers with little resistance. The VOC's infrastructure, warehouses, roads, cinnamon forests was handed over to the British Crown. By the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, Britain officially annexed Ceylon as a crown colony. The cinnamon trade was now under British control, but the spice itself had lost its imperial shine. Cinnamon in decline, from luxury to commodity. During the 17th and early 18th centuries, cinnamon was one of the most expensive and prized spices in Europe. By the early 19th century, however, its status had changed. Three main reasons. Overproduction. The Dutch had saturated the market through aggressive harvesting, particularly in the 1680s and 90s. Competition. Ceylon cinnamon had long been preferred, but cassia, a close relative grown in China and Southeast Asia, began flooding the market. It was cheaper, easier to grow, and acceptable to most consumers. Diversification of flavor. As European cuisine evolved, spices like cinnamon became less central to elite culinary trends. The British recognized that the cinnamon trade would not make them rich, but it could still be useful. They reorganized the harvesting system, investing less in force and more in plantation-style agriculture. British policy, reform or rebranding. Under British rule, the Salagama caste continued to provide the core cinnamon labor force, but the structure shifted. Cinnamon peeling was transformed into a paid, contract-based system. Private European planters were given lands to grow cinnamon as a crop, rather than forage it in wild forests. The Crown taxed exports but did not fix quotas as harshly as the VOC. Still, exploitation remained. Wages were low. Land ownership was restricted. Resistance, though less visible, continued through absenteeism and underground markets. And yet, under British policy, the cinnamon trade stabilized, if modestly. It was no longer a weapon of empire, but a steady export, part of the broader colonial economy that included tea, coffee, and rubber. The trees persist. Cinnamon trees, unlike imperial contracts, do not crumble easily. In the hills of southern Sri Lanka, they continued to grow. Some were cultivated in orderly rows. Others survived in wild groves, tended by families whose ancestors had peeled bark for generations. The act of peeling, once regulated by VOC inspectors, became a seasonal livelihood again. Not easy, not profitable, but dignified in its craftsmanship. Over time, the craft evolved. Tools were refined. Techniques passed from father to son, mother to daughter. Cinnamon remained a part of life, even if its global importance faded. Ceylon cinnamon today. In the present day, Sri Lanka remains the world's largest producer of true cinnamon, Cinnamomum verum, known globally as Ceylon cinnamon. It is prized for its light sweet flavor, fragile paper-thin quills, low coumarin content, safer for health. Sri Lankan cinnamon is exported to dozens of countries. It is used in teas, baked goods, spice blends, perfumes, and pharmaceuticals. But the labor remains mostly small-scale. Thousands of families rely on cinnamon peeling as part of their income. Cooperatives and fair trade initiatives have emerged to improve prices and conditions. Tourism also plays a role, with some visitors touring cinnamon farms and learning the old techniques. Yet the global market is dominated by cheaper cassia. Most people consuming cinnamon today are eating cassia from Indonesia, China, or Vietnam. Ceylon cinnamon is a premium product, quietly present but rarely recognized. Remembering the cinnamon wars. What remains of the centuries of conflict? In Colombo, Dutch-era buildings still line parts of the old fort. In Gala, the massive VOC fortress now houses cafes, galleries, and tourists. In the countryside, stories of cinnamon quotas and colonial punishments still circulate in folk memory. but formal education rarely covers the Cinnamon Wars in depth. The Banda Massacre, the Kandyan Resistance, and the cinnamon quotas imposed by the Dutch and Portuguese have been overshadowed by later struggles, especially the wars for independence in the 20th century. Still, every harvest season, when the bark is peeled and the air fills with that unmistakable scent, the past lingers. Quietly, reflection, the smell of empire. Few empires were built on such a subtle thing as bark. But in Ceylon, cinnamon reshaped power, rewrote maps, and redefined sovereignty. What began as a local craft became a commodity. What began as trade became conquest. And what was once a rare indulgence became ordinary. The trees endured, the people adapted, the monopolies collapsed. And yet, every time cinnamon is sprinkled into a cup of tea or baked into bread, it carries with it, if only faintly, the scent of history. A history of flavor, of force, of forest, of forgotten hands. Story 4. Nutmeg and Blood, the Banda Massacre. In the Banda Sea, deep within the Indonesian archipelago, lies a scattering of small, volcanic islands. On first glance, they appear insignificant green hills rising from blue waters, ringed by coral and silence. But if you stepped onto Banda Nira or Run Island in the early 1600s, the air would not smell like salt or smoke. It would smell like nutmeg, sweet, sharp, almost intoxicating. The warm, resinous scent of this spice hung thick in the air, clung to clothes, filled the hulls of ships, and lined the vaults of Europe's wealthiest banks. In this opening section of Story 4, we begin a slow descent into one of the darkest corners of the spice trade. The Banda Massacre of 1621, a brutal and deliberate act of corporate extermination. But before blood ran through the forests, there was trade, culture, and fragile autonomy. This is the story of how nutmeg turned an island into a battlefield. Nutmeg, a seed worth more than gold. Nutmeg is the seed of the fruit of the Myristica fragrans tree. Its outer covering yields mace, another valuable spice. Both were used in Europe to flavor wine, preserve meat, treat plague symptoms, and craft perfumes. They were seen not just as flavorings, but as medicines, luxuries, and symbols of sophistication. In the early 17th century, nutmeg was one of the rarest and most expensive spices on earth, second only to saffron by weight. And for centuries, the only place it grew was here in the Banda Islands. This gave the Bandanese people power. Though they were few in number, they controlled the world's entire supply of nutmeg and mace. Small in population, perhaps 15,000 across a dozen islands, they maintained this control through navigation, negotiation, and an economy built on free trade. They welcomed traders from India, Java, China, and the Arab world. And when the first Europeans arrived, they were treated the same, as temporary guests, subject to negotiation, not conquest. That would not last. The VOC arrives, the mask of diplomacy. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, formed in 1602, was not merely a trading firm. It had state powers, the right to build forts, wage war, and sign treaties. By 1609, VOC agents had arrived in the Banda Islands. They were met with cautious hospitality. The Bandanese offered to trade nutmeg as they had with others, but refused to sign exclusive contracts. They wanted freedom to trade with the English, the Javanese, the Portuguese. The VOC, however, saw monopoly as essential. Without exclusivity, they couldn't control prices. Without control, they couldn't pay their investors. And so, negotiation turned into pressure. VOC agents demanded treaties. Bandanese leaders stalled. Dutch ships blockaded harbors. Skirmishes broke out on land. For over a decade, the situation remained tense. The Bandanese resisted both Dutch and English efforts to dominate their economy, but the VOC was patient and increasingly brutal. The island of Run, an English outpost in a Dutch sea. One island in particular, Run, became a symbol of resistance. Tiny and remote, it accepted a treaty with the English East India Company in 1616. This infuriated the VOC. The idea that an English flag could fly over even one Bandanese island was unacceptable. The Dutch launched raids, burned crops, and attempted to starve out the English. Though the English held on for a time, they were eventually driven out. But the claim on run remained a legal wrinkle that would come back decades later in one of history's strangest land trades. Meanwhile, the Bandanese saw the growing violence and realized they were no longer dealing with traders but colonizers. Jan Pieter Soon Coen, a name written in blood. In 1618, a man named Jan Pieter Soon Coen became Governor-General of the VOC in the East Indies. To the Dutch Board of Directors, he was efficient. To the people of the Banda Islands, he would become a butcher. Coen believed in total control. He saw the Bandanese refusal to sign exclusive trade deals as rebellion, not negotiation. He argued that unless the VOC acted with decisive force, the nutmeg trade would remain unstable and the company's monopoly would collapse. He began preparing an expedition. The goal: to punish, subdue, and reconfigure the Banda Islands into an obedient plantation colony. It would be swift, it would be systematic, and it would leave the soil soaked in blood. The people of Banda, traders not warriors. Before the massacre, the Bandanese people lived in village communities, each ruled by elders or Ankaya. They farmed, fished, navigated the seas, and maintained oral histories. Islam had been introduced through trade, but indigenous customs still shaped their culture. They were not a militarized society. Their weapons were limited. Their strategies relied on diplomacy and strategic alliances. For generations, that had been enough. But as 1621 approached, and VOC ships gathered just beyond the horizon, it was clear: negotiations had ended. The siege begins. In early 1621, Coen returned to Banda with an armada of ships, a force of 1,500 soldiers, Japanese mercenaries, and the full backing of the VOC board. He had authorization to use any means necessary to bring the islands under Dutch control. The Bandanese, realizing the scale of the threat, attempted last-minute peace talks. They offered new trade deals. They proposed tributes, but it was too late. The Dutch attacked. Villages were surrounded and burned. Crops were destroyed. Civilians, men, women, and children were captured or killed. Elders were rounded up and interrogated under torture. By April 1621, most of the population of the central Banda Islands had been killed, enslaved, or had fled into the hills. The Dutch sealed their monopoly not through trade, but through massacre. The beaches of Banda are quiet now. The palm trees sway gently. The surf is calm. But in 1621, these shores were littered with corpses and burning villages. By the end of that year, the Banda Islands, once a network of free, independent spice traders, had been transformed into a theater of total colonial control. In this second section, we move beyond the massacre itself to explore what came after. This is not a tale of liberation or redemption. It is a story of systematic repopulation, of forced labor, of a plantation economy established on the rubble of genocide. It is about what happens when a corporation wins a war, not a war for land or faith or defense, but a war for seeds and the right to say who may sell them. After the massacre, a landscape rewritten. When Jan Pieter Soon Coen finished his campaign, the VOC controlled the Banda Islands, but the Bandanese were gone, killed, exiled, or enslaved. Contemporary estimates suggest that as many as 14,000 of the island's original inhabitants perished in the campaign, or its aftermath, out of a total pre-conflict population of perhaps 15,000. A few escaped to nearby islands. Others were captured and sent to Batavia, the Dutch stronghold in Java, to serve as enslaved laborers. Some were forcibly converted to Christianity. The few who remained on Banda were tightly monitored and stripped of autonomy. With the local population eliminated, Cohen and the VOC faced a new challenge. Who would tend the nutmeg trees? The Perkin system, a plantation engineered for monopoly. To maintain the nutmeg trade, Cohen implemented a new system. He divided the now depopulated islands into plantation plots, known as perkin. Each perk was assigned to a Dutch settler, called a perkenier, who was responsible for maintaining and harvesting a set number of nutmeg trees. These settlers were not nobles or seasoned planters. Many were former VOC soldiers, sailors, or adventurers granted land in exchange for loyalty and output. But the Perkiniers needed workers, and the Bandanese were dead or gone. So the VOC began importing enslaved people from other parts of Indonesia, as well as from Africa and India. They were shipped to Banda and forced into grueling labor under the tropical sun. They cleared groves, they harvested nutmeg, they dried the fruit, they loaded VOC ships. It was, quite literally, a plantation economy built on foreign hands, producing a crop that once defined an entire native society. Forced labor, surveillance, and control. The enslaved workers lived under harsh conditions. They were branded with ownership marks. Their movements were restricted. Punishments for disobedience included flogging, mutilation, or execution. Families were often separated across different perkin. Nutmeg quotas were fixed, and failure to meet them fell on both the laborer and the perkinier. The VOC stationed military garrisons on the islands, not to defend against foreign powers, but to suppress rebellion. Over time, entire generations were born, lived, and died in forced servitude on land that had once been free. And the nutmeg flowed quill by quill, seed by seed into VOC ships, bound for Batavia, Amsterdam, and beyond. Nutmeg in Europe, exotic spice erased source. In Europe, nutmeg remained a luxury item. It appeared in cookbooks, medicinal texts, and apothecaries. It was sprinkled into wine, baked into cakes, used to treat stomach ailments and ward off the plague. But few consumers knew or cared where it came from. Fewer still knew the story of Banda. The spice was sold in silken packets, stored in ornate jars, gifted between nobles. It carried no scent of blood in the drawing rooms of London or the merchant halls of Amsterdam. Meanwhile, the profits were enormous. VOC shareholders received dividends of up to 40% annually during the company's golden years. Nutmeg, like cloves and cinnamon before it, had become a commodity without a conscience. Smuggling, sabotage, and silent defiance. The VOC's monopoly was effective but not absolute. Despite Cohen's efforts, Bandanese resistance did not disappear. Survivors who had escaped to neighboring islands like Ke or Seram formed communities in exile. From these outposts, they launched occasional raids and supported smugglers. Foreign traders, especially the English and the Portuguese, still sought access to nutmeg. Though VOC ships patrolled the seas and guards inspected every cargo, spice smuggling flourished on the margins. Some enslaved workers in Banda secretly passed seeds to smugglers. Others sabotaged shipments by spoiling fruit or slowing harvests. The forests themselves resisted too. Nutmeg trees do not yield easily under pressure. If harvested too early or poorly tended, they die. The VOC learned this the hard way, watching entire perkin fail when mistreated by inexperienced managers. Still, the system limped forward, fueled by violence, sustained by ships. The trade heard round the world, run for Manhattan. In 1667, the Anglo-Dutch Wars reached a diplomatic conclusion with the Treaty of Breda. As part of the settlement, the Dutch agreed to cede the island of Manhattan to the British, in exchange for formal control of Run Island, the tiny Bandanese outpost that had once raised the English flag. It was a symbolic trade, not of equal worth at the time, but revealing. To the Dutch, nutmeg was still worth more than land in the Americas. Of course, history would reverse the valuation. Manhattan would become New York. Run would fade into obscurity. But in that moment, the spice still ruled the map. Decline of the nutmeg monopoly. By the 18th century, cracks began to appear. Nutmeg trees were successfully smuggled out of Banda. The French transplanted them to Mauritius and Réunion. The British later introduced them to Grenada and other Caribbean islands. Nutmeg cultivation began in Penang and Singapore under colonial rule. The VOC fought back with burnings and sabotage, but it was too late. The monopoly was broken. Nutmeg prices fell. The VOC's power waned. And in 1799, after years of corruption, war, and financial mismanagement, the VOC collapsed. Its assets, forts, lands, plantations were absorbed into the Dutch state. Banda became a crown colony. The plantation system, however, remained. Nutmeg was no longer blood-soaked treasure. It was now a global crop, but its roots still clung to the ashes of a massacre. As we near the end of this story, one final question lingers. What does it say about a world where a single seed can justify a genocide? And when the spice loses its value, what becomes of the people and places it destroyed? The wind moves gently through the nutmeg trees of Banda today. Their green, glossy leaves catch the light. Their fruit splits to reveal the familiar dark brown seed wrapped in red lace nutmeg and mace, the twin treasures of a long-forgotten empire. But here, beneath the shade of these trees, the ground remembers. Not just the footsteps of colonial soldiers, but the silence that followed the screams. In this final section of Story 4, we look at the legacy of the Banda massacre. What happened to the islands in the centuries that followed? How the nutmeg tree spread far beyond Banda, and how the memory of massacre was buried beneath maps, trade routes, and polite economic histories. This is the aftermath, not the dramatic climax, but the long, dull erosion of an empire's memory written in exports, plantations, and the absence of a people. The long colonial shad. After the collapse of the Dutch East India Company in 1799, Banda became a Dutch colonial possession, administered directly by the crown. The spice trade, once ferociously defended, was now just one part of a larger imperial portfolio. Nutmeg was still grown. The Perkins system, though diminished, persisted in some form. But with competition from Mauritius, Grenada, Zanzibar, and others, the Dutch monopoly was gone. Without the exclusivity, nutmeg lost its power, prices dropped, forts were neglected, fewer ships docked in Banda. The plantations became quieter, less guarded, still cruel. And yet, there was no return to independence. The Bandanese, who had once governed themselves as traders, elders, and navigators, had not returned. Their culture, their governance, and their systems were broken beyond repair. A people had been erased, and their islands repurposed. The rise of Grenada and the spice diaspora. In the 18th and 19th centuries, British colonists introduced nutmeg to the Caribbean. The island of Grenada took to nutmeg quickly. The soil and climate were ideal. By the 20th century, Grenada had become one of the largest global producers of nutmeg and mace, branding itself the Spice Isle, a title once claimed by Banda. Elsewhere, Zanzibar, under Omani and then British control, developed vast spice plantations including nutmeg, clove, and cinnamon, using enslaved and indentured labor. Nutmeg, once a jealously guarded Banda native, had become a transplanted global commodity. But nowhere else carried the same cost. Only in Banda had an entire population been exterminated to secure the seed. The silence of the archives. In VOC archives, the Banda massacre is recorded in chilling terms. Expeditions conducted. Villages secured. Land redistributed. Populations resettled. It is a ledger's massacre, documented like shipping manifests or trade losses. The language is cold, the details bureaucratic. In many Western histories, the massacre is a footnote, a curiosity, a line between treaties and trade deals. In schoolbooks, if mentioned at all, it's framed as part of competition in the spice trade. Rarely is it called what it was: ethnic cleansing for profit, corporate conquest, economic extermination. Even in Banda, memory is complicated. Centuries of control Portuguese, Dutch, Japanese, and later Indonesian have blurred local knowledge. Oral traditions persist, but formal monuments are few. There is no global remembrance day for the Banda massacre, no widespread reckoning. Just the trees and the stories. The nutmeg today, ordinary and forgotten. Today, nutmeg sits in spice racks across the world. It flavors. Holiday baking in Europe. Eggnog and mulled wine. Indian biryanis. Indonesian rendang. Caribbean stews. It is no longer rare, no longer precious. You can buy it ground in bulk at supermarket chains with no sense of the blood once shed for its exclusivity. The Banda nutmeg, the original, still grows on the islands. The trees have changed little. The fruit still splits the same way. The scent is still sharp, sweet, clean. But its meaning has changed. Cultural resurgence and historical reckoning. In recent years, a quiet movement has begun. Historians in Indonesia and the Netherlands have revisited VOC archives. Activists and writers have worked to restore the memory of Banda's lost people. Local schools and communities have begun preserving oral histories. Documentaries, museum exhibits, and novels have slowly revived the narrative. The massacre is no longer entirely buried. But this resurgence is slow and often overshadowed by broader colonial histories. Banda remains a remote cluster of islands, beautiful, isolated, rarely visited. Still, for those who walk its beaches, climb its hills, or harvest its spices, the ghosts are close. The stories are whispered in the groves. The silence is heavy. And the scent of nutmeg remains. Reflection: what the spice cost. If history is written by the victors, then the story of Banda was long unwritten. It was a blank space beneath maps, a forgotten footnote in company ledgers. But history also lives in trees, in bark, in fruit, in labor. Nutmeg may no longer shape empires, but it shaped the world we live in. A world where companies act like states, where profit justifies violence, where landscapes are emptied and renamed, where the cost of luxury is paid by those farthest from it. And perhaps most of all, it reminds us: a seed can start a forest or a fire. Story 5: Salt and Power, the Roman Preservation Machine. Beneath the marble arches of ancient Rome, where legions marched and roads stretched to the ends of the known world, a quiet substance moved in the shadows of empire: salt. It did not gleam like gold. It did not intoxicate like wine. It did not seduce like silk. But salt preserved, sustained, and connected. In this first section of Story 5, we trace the rise of salt as a vital engine of Roman infrastructure, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Salt powered armies, fed cities, sustained agriculture, and subtly shaped everything from road construction to political control. It was white gold, not because it dazzled, but because it endured. This is the story of how an unassuming mineral became the quiet machinery behind one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. Salt, substance of survival. Salt sodium chloride is essential to life. It balances fluid levels, supports muscle function, and enables preservation of food. Long before refrigeration, salt was civilization's preservative, the single most reliable way to store meat, fish, and even vegetables. In Rome, salt was not a seasoning. It was a strategic resource. And the Romans, masters of systems, Roads and logistics understood this deeply. The Salaria, Road of Salt. One of the oldest roads in Rome is the Via Salaria, literally, the Salt Road. This ancient trade route predates the Republic itself. Originally used by the Sabines, it connected the Tiber River to the salt pans of Ostia, Rome's port city. By the early Republic, this route became a central artery for salt transport. Salt was harvested from coastal evaporation ponds near Ostia, transported inland by mule, cart, and shoulder, stored in warehouses near the Forum, distributed to markets, garrisons, and families. The Via Salaria was not grand or ceremonial, it was practical, durable, and busy. It existed not for spectacle, but for function. And in many ways, it symbolized Rome's priorities. The salt dole and urban control. As Rome expanded, so did its population, and with it, the need to feed, control, and pacify urban masses. By the 2nd century BCE, the state began instituting grain and salt distributions to citizens, particularly the poor. This policy, known broadly as annona, formed a rudimentary welfare system. Salt, distributed through public granaries and warehouses, served both as nourishment and control. It ensured basic sustenance. It prevented riots. It kept the working classes dependent on the state. Later emperors expanded these programs, pairing grain, oil, and salt with public spectacles, the infamous bread and circuses, designed to maintain order. In this way, salt was not just a resource, it was governance. Salt as soldiers' pay. One of the most persistent historical myths is that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, giving us the word salary. While this is likely an exaggeration, it holds a kernel of truth. The Latin word salarium originally referred to a stipend paid to soldiers, possibly intended to purchase salt. Salt rations were common in Roman military life. Soldiers preserved meat using brine. Salt was essential for survival during campaigns. Whether or not it was paid in salt, soldiers were certainly supported by salt. Over time, salarium evolved into the broader idea of a regular wage, giving rise to the modern salary. The etymological trace is faint, but real. Thus, in a linguistic sense, salt remains embedded in how we understand labor, compensation, and value. Salt and Roman expansion. Rome's hunger for salt shaped its geography of conquest. Salt was too important to leave to market whims or foreign control. As the Republic expanded, it prioritized access to salt pans along coastal regions, salt springs in inland territories, trade routes connecting remote production zones. In Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia, salt was seized as part of broader annexations. In North Africa, Roman engineers developed new evaporation methods suited to arid climates. Salt was never the stated reason for conquest, but it was always accounted for in the aftermath. The logistics of empire feeding troops, supplying forts, provisioning cities required a constant, reliable salt supply. The Roman army didn't march on salt alone, but without it, they wouldn't march far. Engineering, the white resource. Romans engineered not just roads and aqueducts but saltworks. At Ostia, Puteoli, and other sites, the state constructed evaporation basins, carefully shaped to maximize sunlight, storage houses, elevated and ventilated, canals to manage tidal inflow and outflow. In colder or wetter provinces, they tapped brine springs, using boiling systems to extract salt. Roman engineers adapted to every climate, refining and expanding techniques borrowed from Etruscans, Greeks, and North Africans. Their goal wasn't innovation, it was stability. The constant movement of salt was essential to the machinery of state. And the salt moved, day after day, silently, predictably. Salt class and consumption. Salt also played a quiet role in Roman class structure. Wealthy households used salt for preservation, but also for culinary showmanship. Salted fish, meat, and exotic sauces like garum became signs of sophistication. Poorer citizens relied on salt for basic survival to preserve beans, fish, and vegetables across seasons. Rural farmers traded surplus salt for goods or services. In some cases, salt functioned as barter in remote provinces. Thus, while salt was everywhere, how it was used said much about who you were. Salt in Rome marked the boundary between necessity and luxury. Religious and ritual uses. Salt also had a spiritual role. It was used in purification rites, sprinkled on altars and sacrificed animals, symbolized incorruptibility and permanence, incorporated in funeral rites and oaths. Roman priests' pontifices kept ceremonial salt in sacred containers, sometimes mixing it with flour mola salsa as an offering to the gods. Even in death, salt marked transitions between life and afterlife, body and spirit. In the vast landscape of the Roman Empire stretching from the Scottish Highlands to the sands of Arabia, salt moved across borders, seas, and centuries. It was never glamorous, never ceremonial, rarely the subject of marble inscriptions or triumphal processions. But it was everywhere, as essential to the daily life of a soldier as to the long-term survival of a city. In this section, we move beyond Rome itself. We follow salt's quiet journey across the provinces, how it shaped trade, law, and imperial control. We'll see how salt was both commodity and symbol, how it linked the Roman economy, and how its infrastructure foretold the very DNA of Europe's modern roads and cities. Salt may not have worn a laurel wreath, but it formed the sinews of empire. Salt's imperial geography. By the height of the Roman Empire, c. 117 CE, salt production and distribution formed a network across the provinces. Unlike more glamorous commodities like wine or olive oil, salt was not bound to luxury. It was embedded in survival, and its presence was geographically strategic. Key regions became salt centers. Ostia and Servia on the Italian coast. Saloni, modern Droitwich, in Roman Britain. Narbonensis in southern Gaul. Aquisecchi, Aix-en-Provence with brine springs. Po Valley for inland evaporation. North Africa, along the Mediterranean littoral. Dalmatian coast and the Black Sea. Saltworks were developed wherever the climate and terrain allowed. In cooler regions, brine boiling was more common. In warm, arid areas, evaporation ponds dominated. But the geography of salt wasn't just economic, it was military and administrative. Where salt was produced, Rome placed roads, warehouses, Horia, garrisons, customs posts, stations, salinarii. It was logistics at scale, centuries before industrialization. Roman law and salt regulation. Because salt was vital, it required regulation. In the Republican era, the censors, magistrates responsible for public morals and finances, supervised salt pricing and production. Contracts for salt mining were awarded under the system of publicani, private contractors. Later, under the empire, salt became more centralized. The Fiscus Salinarum, salt treasury, managed salt revenues. In some regions, salt became a state monopoly, with fixed prices and official routes. Cities could be taxed in salt quotas instead of coin. Control of salt routes became a tool of diplomacy or coercion. And where law existed, so did crime. Salt smuggling was a known issue, particularly near provincial borders or river routes. Enforcement was difficult in mountainous terrain, and local officials often took bribes. But the state's involvement in salt showed something deeper. Rome didn't just rely on conquest and tribute, it built economic systems designed to last. Salt in the Roman army. Wherever the legions went, salt followed. Roman military outposts needed food that could last through months of campaign or siege. Salted pork, beef, carne salata, fish, and vegetables were standard issue. Each legionary carried rations including salted staples in his sarsana, the soldier's gear pack. Salt was also used to treat wounds, antiseptic brine. In animal care, especially horses and oxen. In leather tanning for sandals, armor straps, tents. For preserving military supplies, grain, beans, fruits. Salt was also critical for Roman naval logistics. On warships, triremes and quinquiremes, where space and rot were constant challenges, salt-preserved food kept crews fed for long Mediterranean voyages. From Hadrian's Wall to Petra, salt sustained the empire's footprint. The emotional and economic weight of salt. Salt did more than preserve food or tan leather. It held emotional and symbolic value, often reflected in Roman speech and literature. The Latin phrase cum grano salis, with a grain of salt, reflected caution, even skepticism, a linguistic nod to the seasoning's power to temper a situation or statement. Salt was also central in hospitality. Roman households might greet guests with bread and salt, a gesture echoing earlier Mediterranean traditions. Writers like Pliny the Elder and Cato the Elder cataloged salt's virtues in encyclopedic detail. Salt cured hams, fermented sauces, even stabilized wine. Cato's De Agricultura lists salting techniques for olives, cabbage, and cheeses. Salt was domestic infrastructure quietly essential to Roman culinary and agricultural life. The birth of garum, empire's salty sauce. No discussion of Roman salt can ignore garum, the empire's most beloved and pungent condiment. Garum was made by fermenting fish, typically anchovies, mackerel, or tuna, in large vats with copious amounts of salt. Over weeks or months, enzymes broke down the flesh into a liquid umami concentrate. This salty, protein-rich liquid was exported across the empire, added to nearly every savory dish, stored in amphorae and marked with trade stamps, sold in markets, inns, and elite kitchens. Garum factories dotted the coasts of Spain, southern Italy, and North Africa. Some were industrial-scale operations, with hundreds of slaves and enormous brine tanks. It was Rome's ketchup, soy sauce, and Worcestershire combined, and none of it existed without salt. Salt and the roots of European cities. Salt also shaped the map of Europe. Many modern cities trace their origins to Roman salt sites. Salzburg in Austria, Salt Castle. Salerno in Italy. Salins-les-Bains in France. Droitwich, ancient Salony in England. Halle in Germany, from Hal, an ancient word for salt. Roads like the Via Salaria, Via Flaminia, and Via Cassia pass through these regions, connecting salt hubs to military and civic centers. Over centuries, settlements formed around these routes. Inns, taverns, markets, places of rest and exchange. Many of today's European roads still follow Roman alignments, built first to move salt as much as soldiers. Salt, quiet grip. Salt never built an aqueduct, it never wrote poetry, it never won a war. But it made survival possible in mess tents, rural kitchens, merchant ships, and city homes. It gave Rome a layer of permanence, a preservative not just of meat, but of systems. Salt didn't conquer territory, but it held it. And yet, the systems that depended on salt were also fragile, prone to disruption by bad weather, poor harvests, mismanagement, price manipulation, corruption, and black markets. When the empire's infrastructure began to falter in the late 3rd and 4th centuries, salt's quiet threads began to fray. Salt does not spoil, it preserves. And yet nothing lasts forever. In this final section of Story 5, we explore how the infrastructure, economy, and governance built around salt in the Roman world slowly eroded. Not in a blaze of drama, but in gradual decline, just as the empire itself frayed at the edges. We'll follow the diminishing trade routes, the decay of roads, and the slow loss of state control over salt. We'll see how a seemingly simple mineral became one of the many quiet casualties of empire's slow fall, and how its echoes shaped the world long after Rome was gone. The empire ages, and so does its infrastructure. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was aging, fracturing under internal pressures, external invasions, civil wars, and administrative bloat. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 CE, brought repeated invasions by Goths, Franks, Persians, rampant inflation and currency debasement, revolts and breakaway states, plague and population decline. In response, emperors like Diocletian and Constantine restructured the economy. They instituted more rigid tax systems, military reforms, and price edicts. Among the reforms was a tightening of control over essential goods, including salt. Salt, which had once flowed with freedom, was now closely monitored, rationed, and taxed more heavily. Smuggling increased. Shortages became common. The once fluid trade networks began to crack. In short, when the system needed salt most, its delivery became less reliable. Salt becomes a burden. Under Diocletian's reforms, the annona system, the distribution of grain, oil, and salt became compulsory. Cities and landowners were required to supply salt to the state as part of their taxes. This salt tax, known in later times as Gabelle, became a source of widespread resentment, rural discontent, evasion, and corruption. What had once been a public good became a state burden. Peasants, no longer receiving salt as a stabilizing provision, now owed it as a levy. Some local elites abandoned rural estates rather than meet quotas. Others hired private militias to avoid collection. The salt economy became fragile, weaponized, and corrosive. The decline of roads and routes. Roman roads, once the lifeblood of salt transport, also suffered. Without central funding, maintenance declined. Toll collection by private interests increased. Travelers risked banditry, impassable conditions, collapsing bridges, weakened garrisons. The Via Salaria, which once hummed with the daily movement of carts from Ostia, fell into partial disrepair by the 5th century. As transportation broke down, salt couldn't reach inland provinces. Cities grew desperate. Coastal regions hoarded supplies. Trade stagnated. Salt became regional, inconsistent, and costly. And with it, so did preservation, food storage, and long-distance provisioning. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It had military consequences. Salt shortages and military collapse. As legions were stretched thinner, food preservation became harder. Armies couldn't sustain long campaigns without stable supplies. Had to rely more on foraging, looting, or local requisitions. Faced lower morale, health issues, and desertion. Salt had once been an invisible backbone of the Roman military. In decline, its absence was felt more than its presence. By the time of the sack of Rome in 410 CE, the city was no longer fed by the secure logistics of earlier centuries. Trade from Africa had slowed. Roads were uncertain. Ports were vulnerable. When Rome fell, salt didn't stop existing, but its central role in administration and power collapsed with the empire's larger systems. Post-Roman salt, fragmentation, and control. After the Western Roman Empire's fall, salt continued to be important, but now under new conditions. In the early medieval period, monasteries took over salt works in Gaul and Italy. Feudal lords controlled access to brine wells. Salt roads became toll roads. Salt taxes reappeared under new rulers, often more oppressive. In some places, salt regained its sacred and cultural role. In others, it became a symbol of oppression. In France, the salt tax, Gabelle, would later become a hated institution, helping spark revolutionary anger in the 18th century. In China, salt taxes financed entire dynasties. Rome had shown the template, salt as sustenance, governance, and control. Others simply inherited it. Salt's lingering footprint. Even in decay, Rome left fingerprints. Modern European cities built on Roman salt hubs. Languages still echoing salt's legacy: salary, sauce, salami. Road systems following ancient trade paths. Legal and tax precedents with Roman origins. Salt outlasted Rome not as imperial infrastructure, but as a cultural thread woven into daily life. Today, salt is everywhere and inexpensive, but this is a modern luxury. For most of history, salt was precious, fought over, taxed, and hoarded. The idea that salt once held empires together may feel distant, yet it lingers in how we think about wages, preservation, logistics, and state control. Reflection: the fragility of the essential. Rome did not collapse because of salt, but the decline of salt's infrastructure mirrored the empire's decay. Fragile roads, failing logistics, discontented citizens, resource shortages, overregulation, and uneven distribution. The story of Roman salt is not a story of drama. It's a story of maintenance, or the lack thereof. A reminder that civilizations can rot from within, not through flame and sword, but through logistical stagnation. And salt, quiet, essential, forgotten, was among the first to feel the shift. Even today, the world depends on invisible systems: supply chains, preservation, transport, and taxation. Systems built not on spectacle, but on function. Salt reminds us that history's greatest collapses often begin with what no one noticed breaking. Story 6: Copper Roads and the Quiet Empire of the Andes. High in the spine of South America, where the Andes fold against the sky, a great empire once rose without wheels, without written script, without currency as we know it. The Inca Empire, or Tawantinsuyu, did not gleam with gold in the eyes of its people, nor did it rely on iron or horses. Instead, it was bound together by fiber, stone, and metal, notably copper, the quiet engine of tools, infrastructure, and labor. This section takes us into the heart of this empire, not through its conquests or ceremonial splendor, but through its utilitarian copper industry, its vast road systems, and its intricate web of daily life that depended on resource management more than military drama. Where European empires documented everything in ink and parchment, the Incas recorded their history in knotted strings and ritual memory. And behind the scenes of their vast civilization was the steady, reddish glow of copper forged, hammered, and traded across one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. An empire without the wheel. The Inca Empire, at its height in the early 16th century, stretched more than 2,500 miles from modern Colombia to Chile. It covered 2 million square kilometers and ruled over 10 million people, all without wheels, draft animals aside from llamas, iron tools, a written language, money. What it had instead were roads, 20,000 miles of them, and a system of governance so efficient that messages could travel faster than horseback couriers in medieval Europe. And much of that system was quietly supported by copper. While gold and silver dazzled the Spanish conquistadors, copper was the metal of survival. Copper as the Incan workhorse. Unlike iron, which requires extremely high smelting temperatures, copper was more accessible to early metal workers. In the Andean highlands, where the landscape produced rich veins of ore, copper became the primary utilitarian metal. The Incas and their predecessors used copper to create agricultural tools like tumis, ceremonial knives often repurposed for daily use, chisels, plows, and digging sticks, decorative and religious items, alloys, particularly bronze, through mixing copper with arsenic or tin. Needles and fishhooks. Copper axes, which sometimes functioned as a kind of tribute item or proto-currency. But these weren't mass-produced industrial goods. Each item was shaped, hammered, and refined in local workshops, managed by state-appointed artisans called Kayamyuk. Copper was essential to both state projects and subsistence life. Mining the mountains. Mining copper in the Andes was labor-intensive, dangerous, and surprisingly widespread. Evidence suggests that copper mining began in pre-Incan cultures, particularly the Moche, Tiwanaku, and Wari civilizations. The Inca inherited and expanded this knowledge. Key sites included Chuquicamata, northern Chile, one of the oldest and largest open-pit copper mines in the world, in use for over 2,000 years. Cajamarca and Cusco regions, rich in copper-bearing minerals. Lake Titicaca Basin, provided both copper and tin used for bronze. The Inca did not use gunpowder or industrial tools. Instead, they relied on fire setting, heating rock with fire, then cooling it rapidly with water to crack it. Stone tools and wooden wedges. Human labor, often drawn from mida, a labor tax required of all adult males. Ore was transported by llamas and human porters across treacherous mountain paths. There were no wheelbarrows, no carts, just woven baskets, sinew-strapped packs, and the backs of people. Metallurgy and control. Metallurgy in the Andes was both art and administration. Skilled workers were sometimes relocated by the state to key centers, forming specialized colonies of metal workers. These artisans smelted and shaped copper in low-temperature furnaces, using charcoal, simple clay crucibles, blowpipes to increase heat, ceramic molds for casting. Bronze tools copper mixed with arsenic or tin were more durable and appeared widely after 1000 CE. But pure copper remained dominant in daily tools and ceremonial objects. The state regulated production and distribution. Copper was collected as tribute from communities. Finished goods were redistributed through state warehouses. Metal was sometimes buried as ritual offerings, connecting labor with religion. This wasn't capitalism. It was a redistributive economy rooted in reciprocity and central planning. Roads of Empire, the Quhapac Nyan. All this copper, along with food, textiles, and information, moved along the Quhapac Nyan, or the Inca road system. This network, stretched over 20,000 miles, included stone-paved highways, rope bridges, and staircases, traversed desert, forest, and snow-covered peaks, connected local communities to administrative centers and the imperial capital at Cusco. No wheeled vehicles ever traveled these roads. Only llamas and chasquis, relay runners, moved across them. Copper tools were used in maintaining the roads, building tambos, rest houses, and calcas, storehouses, supporting agriculture with terracing tools forged from copper and bronze, constructing stone structures with copper chisels and hammers. Without copper, many of the state's physical achievements, especially road and field infrastructure, would have been impractically laborious. Daily life quiet metal. For the average Andean farmer, copper was not glamorous. It was a hoe head used in the potato field. It was a spoon or a needle. It was the plated surface on a ceremonial object you owed the temple. It was a tool, not a treasure. But without it, life slowed. Food spoiled faster, crops were harder to harvest, roads took longer to maintain, tools dulled and broke. Gold adorned temples. Copper made the state work. A comparison in contrast. While Europe moved toward iron, the Inca world leaned on copper. This wasn't due to technological ignorance, it was a strategic adaptation to available materials and social systems. Inca agriculture was based on terracing and hand tools. Their lack of large domesticated animals meant no plow teams. With no iron, copper was the next best choice and quite effective in highland conditions. The Inca state didn't prioritize conquest through metallurgy. It emphasized infrastructure, storage, and labor management. And perhaps this is where copper's story becomes even more interesting, not because it dazzled, but because it endured. In the Inca world, copper was not mined for personal wealth or private profit. It was not bartered in bustling markets or used to strike coins. Instead, it was folded into a system far more complex and, in some ways, more enduring than many ancient economies. This section turns to the true strength of the Inca state, not military might, but logistics. We will explore how the empire moved goods like copper, organized its population, and coordinated agriculture, construction, and trade without writing or currency. At the center of it all stood the state's greatest invention: centralized reciprocity. Here, copper becomes more than a tool. It becomes a unit of obligation, a symbol of loyalty, and a material thread in a finely woven imperial web. The mita, labor in lieu of money. The Inca didn't use coins. Instead, they structured society around the mita system, a labor tax requiring able-bodied men to contribute time and skill to state projects. This could involve mining copper ore, smelting and crafting tools, building roads and storehouses, farming state lands, weaving cloth or making pottery. A copper chisel may have been forged by a man from Chinchasuyu, carried by llama to a tambo near Arequipa, used to build a granary wall in Cusco, then passed on again. Tools were never just possessions. They were state property, shared utility, and proof of service. Copper tools moved not just through markets, but through mandated cooperation. The mita wasn't slavery, though it had burdensome elements. It was part of a reciprocal social contract. Citizens gave labor. The state returned protection, food in times of famine, and access to land. Copper helped make that labor productive and mobile. Calcas, the silent warehouses. Every few miles along the roads and near population centers, the Incas constructed calcas, state storage buildings built to hold dried maize and potatoes, textiles and clothing, weapons, tools, especially bronze and copper implements, dried fish, llama jerky, medicinal herbs. Some calcas were specialized, built at high altitudes to preserve potatoes, or along the coast to store salted fish. Ventilation slits, stone floors, and raised platforms kept food dry and cool. Copper tools often began and ended their life cycles in these granaries. When laborers needed to build new terraces or clear forests, copper axes and chisels were distributed by state agents. Afterward, they were collected, cleaned, and stored. This rotation of goods kept the empire functioning without shops or coinage. It also allowed for rapid mobilization in response to famine, invasion, or royal decree. Copper in agricultural systems. Inca agriculture wasn't possible without metal tools, especially in the difficult terrain of the Andes. With copper or bronze tools, farmers could dig irrigation channels, build and maintain andines, agricultural terraces, turn hard volcanic soil, harvest with more precision. Without oxen or plows, every furrow was dug by hand. A chuki, a foot plow with a copper or bronze edge, was essential. Women used copper needles and awls in weaving and preparing yarn, a key form of tribute. Though brittle compared to iron, copper's malleability made it perfect for casting into specific shapes. A chisel for cutting stone, a hoe blade for breaking soil, a knife for butchering. Where gold was melted into ceremonial discs, copper built terraces, repaired tools, and harvested potatoes. The quipu, accounting without writing. So how did the Incas keep track of it all? They had no alphabet or written records. Instead, They used quipu bundles of knotted cords in various colors, lengths, and textures, suspended from a central cord. A trained quipu kamyuk could read these cords to determine census data, tribute owed, inventory levels in warehouses, labor rotations, military conscriptions. Copper goods were likely tallied in this system, with knots marking how many tools were produced, distributed, or returned. Quipu allowed a non-literate bureaucracy to manage an empire as vast as any in Eurasia. We still don't fully understand quipu reading today, but recent research suggests that some may have contained narrative data histories or accounts, not just numbers. It's likely the movement of copper mined in Chuquicamata, stored in a highland calca, used in a road crew in Cajamarca, was captured in knotted thread. Crafting and redistribution. Copper objects were typically created in state-run or temple-affiliated workshops, known as Yanakuna centers. Specialist artisans smelted copper ore in ceramic furnaces, shaped items using stone hammers, chisels, and anvils, cast ceremonial items using lost wax techniques, produced mass quantities of tools, standardized for state use. The Inca elite tightly controlled metal access. Copper was not traded casually. It was assigned, deliberately placed where needed most, and after use, it could be melted and repurposed. This practice built material continuity. A chisel used in one project might be reforged for another generation's task. Some copper was set aside for religious offerings buried beneath temples or mountains as huacas, sacred deposits meant to appease the gods or ensure good harvests. In this way, copper served not just practical ends but spiritual and political ones, reinforcing the authority of the Sapa Inca emperor and his divine claim to rule. Copper versus gold, two metals, two meanings. Spanish conquistadors famously hunted for gold, but the Inca saw a distinction. Gold was the sweat of the sun, silver the tears of the moon. Copper had no poetic name but immense utility. Gold and silver adorned mummies and temples but did not support daily life. Copper did. It was closer to the people, embedded in labor, food production, and infrastructure. The Spanish plundered gold. They ignored copper, misunderstanding its strategic value. What they missed was this. In an empire built on reciprocal labor and planned economy, copper was the connective tissue. It didn't shine, but it worked. The quiet collapse. When the Spanish arrived in 1532, the Inca Empire was already weakened by a recent civil war, a smallpox epidemic introduced from afar, succession disputes, strained regional loyalties. What the conquistadors did not expect was how quickly the empire would unravel once central control broke down. Copper mining ceased in many areas as labor systems collapsed. Tools fell out of circulation. Roads were no longer maintained. Workshops were dismantled or abandoned. Without mita, calcas, or redistribution, even the most basic agricultural systems began to struggle. In just a few years, the logistical genius of the Andes fell silent. Copper, once shaped by calloused hands across thousands of miles, sat idle in sheds, its function suspended in a new world order it had not been made for. The final chapter of the Inca copper story doesn't end in fire and destruction, but in quiet repurposing, colonial reordering, and cultural survival beneath the surface. While copper tools no longer shaped terraces under the direction of Cusco, they did not disappear. This final section explores what happened after the fall of Tawantinsuyu, the afterlife of copper in a colonized Andes, and how a metal once managed through collective obligation became a commodity, a target of taxation, and a symbol of resistance. We'll see how a civilization organized around reciprocal duty was restructured under European logic, and how the echoes of copper working still resonate in the Andean highlands today. A metal without a system. When the Spanish captured Atahualpa in 1532, they did not just decapitate a royal lineage. They collapsed the organizational heart of an empire. The Mita labor system dissolved almost immediately. Roads went unmanned. State warehouses were raided, burned, or simply left to rot. Quipu were misunderstood or discarded. Metalworkers once state assets fled, resisted, or were absorbed into colonial economies. Copper, stripped of its systemic infrastructure, found itself without context. It was no longer a tool in a vast redistribution network, no longer controlled by specialized guilds, no longer embedded in religious or civic ceremonies. It became a material for sale, not service, and in doing so it changed meaning. Colonial mining and the silver obsession. Spanish authorities had little interest in copper. Their focus turned to silver, especially at sites like Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, where one of the largest silver lodes in world history was discovered. Huancavelica, with its rich deposits of mercury, essential for silver refining. Copper mines, unless conveniently located or easy to exploit, were often abandoned or operated at a minor scale. However, indigenous miners still extracted copper, often for local use or limited trade. The colonial system reintroduced a forced labor tax, called the repartimiento, similar in mechanics to the Mita but stripped of reciprocity and state support. Now, instead of working for mutual benefit, Andean laborers were compelled to toil for colonial gain, under brutal conditions, and for little or no compensation. Copper lost its associative dignity. Copper as craft in resistance. Despite colonial pressure, copper working did not vanish. It simply retreated into the domestic sphere, the village workshop, and the sacred. Andean communities continued to craft agricultural tools, produce ritual objects for local ceremonies, maintain traditional metallurgical techniques, trade copper through informal networks beyond colonial oversight. Some copper items were made to appear rough or unremarkable, camouflaging their deeper meaning. Others combined Christian iconography with pre-Columbian symbolism, creating hybrid tools and ornaments that confounded Spanish authorities. In places like Lake Titicaca and the Cusco Valley, metalworking traditions persisted as quiet acts of cultural preservation. What had once been a state-directed operation became a distributed, resilient memory, a slow burn rather than a flash. The long afterlife of Inca roads and tools. Though much of the Quhapac-Ñan fell into disuse, many of its segments remained active, especially in remote areas where Spanish oversight was weakest. Copper tools, often passed down through generations, continued to be used for terrace farming, stone repair, community rituals, building homes and footbridges. In this sense, the tools became witnesses, links to a time before conquest, when work was offered to the Sapa Inca, not a European crown. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as anthropologists explored Andean culture, they found copper blades still in use, hammered and repaired over centuries, bearing the wear of not just hands, but history. The metallurgical legacy in modern Andes. Today, Andean metallurgical heritage lives on in surprising ways. Small-scale copper mining continues in Bolivia and Peru, often in cooperatives or artisanal settings. Traditional copperworking survives in communities like San Jose de Moro and Cusco, often passed from parent to child. Museums showcase ancient bronze axes and chisels, many still bearing tool marks, reminding us that they were once not relics but implements. Activists and artists reclaim pre-Columbian metallurgical motifs as symbols of indigenous identity and resistance. While modern Peru and Bolivia rely more on industrial-scale mining, especially for global copper demand, the cultural roots run deep. The metal still evokes endurance, collective strength. the power of skilled labor over brute conquest. Copper no longer forms the spine of empire, but it remains in the hands of farmers, craftsmen, and memory keepers, quietly shaping the present. Reflections on function over flash. The story of Inca copper is not one of glamour, nor tragedy in the usual sense. It is a story of tools, not weapons; movement, not spectacle; structure, not domination; collapse followed by persistence. Unlike gold or silver, copper was everywhere, doing everything. It bound together labor systems, logistics, and survival. It dug terraces, lifted stones, harvested crops, and built roads. And when the empire that coordinated it fell, copper quietly kept going in different forms, with different meanings, but with enduring presence. The Incas did not build great armories. They built storage sheds, warehouses, and terraces. They governed through organization, not coercion. Copper made that possible. And perhaps that is copper's greatest lesson. Not every form of power glitters. Some are reddish-brown, practical, and carried in calloused hands.